Good evening, everybody. I'm actually not going to speak about the Middle East this evening, but I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. What I want to do for you this evening is move in three different directions. First, make some comments on the current political moment in which we find ourselves. And then, because while I am a Tocqueville scholar, I'm a deep lover of Plato's works, and I've probably taught the Republic somewhere between 60 and 80 times. And every time I go back to that book, I feel like I'm a little child playing in the sandbox, and I realize that this book is just so magnificent. And so, since some of your readings are on Plato, I want to talk about Plato, and then also finally to bring us to Tocqueville, because as I said at our dinner table, I think he's the last one standing, and by that I mean, of all the great social theorists of the 19th and 20th century, I do think Alexis de Tocqueville is the only one who has a comprehensive vision that not only makes sense of what happened after the 1850s when he died, but helps us understand the 21st century. And it was actually part of the reason I went to the Middle East was to try this out and to find out whether, in fact, Tocqueville could apply to the Middle East. My conclusion is that he does. But let me start with the contemporary political moment. And I don't wish to step on anyone's toes here, but I do wish to speak as candidly as I can about where I think we are in this country. I want to talk about the Republicans first and Trump and why he took the nomination. There's been a lot of talk about populism, that Trump is riding this populist wave, and it's really quite remarkable to me that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, which could not agree on anything over the last 20 years, both decided that that was the term that we were going to use to understand this phenomenon. This is worthy of some investigation. My view is, not surprisingly, you'll discover, is that actually I think Tocqueville saw this problem in the 1830s. I don't think it's a problem of populism at all. I mean, yes, we can use that label, but what's really at issue is the inadequacy of a tremendous experiment we have tried since 1989, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, this combination of globalization and identity politics. And my view increasingly is that really, irrespective of Trump, forget Trump, what is happening is that that tremendous experiment from 1989 to, say, let's date it to 2016, is rapidly unraveling. And people are realizing that the two ways in which we should think of ourselves as global citizens and as bearers of this or that identity is simply not working. And to come to the point, we need a home. We need a home where we're reaching out and building a world together with other people. And that is simply not that has not worked with globalization, identity politics. So, and I think Tocqueville saw this problem. He thought, and I'll say more about this later, he saw that what would happen as we marched into the democratic age was that our connections to one another would become increasingly frail, that we would become lonely and isolated citizens, and that he thought this was the great peril that would face the democratic age in the future. And I think this is exactly where we are right now. So I refuse to think of it in terms of populism. I think Tocqueville saw it, I'll give a shorthand, he saw it as the French Revolution problem, by which he meant that human beings would come to be completely delinked from all the connections they'd have, and they would think of themselves in universalist, cosmopolitan terms. Tocqueville saw this in the 1830s. I think that's the problem. So it's not, I'll use a shorthand, it's not Jefferson versus Madison, it's not the yeoman farmer versus the city person. No, it's not that. It's really what I call the French Revolution problem. It's the problem of the disembodied life that we all confront in the democratic age. But why Trump specifically? How did this work in the Republican Party? My sense of this, many of you are old enough to remember this, the Republican coalition was a strange coalition. It consisted of I'll give the philosophical shorthands, Aristotelians, largely conservative Catholics, evangelicals who could trace their lineage to Calvin, free market conservatives that would go to Hayek. Were there others? I'm sure there were. Aquinas for the cultural conservatives. It didn't work. It was theoretically incoherent, and the only reason it held together was because of two forces that they could all agree upon that they opposed, namely the progressives in the Democratic Party and the foreign threat with the Cold War. Once that disappears, or at least once the Cold War threat disappears, the whole thing comes unraveled. So my view is that the Republican Party was doomed to fail at some point anyway, and Trump was simply the igniter of something that was ready to detonate. Now, I think Trump I think he speaks to this problem, his language of nationalism. Again, I'm not defending Trump. I'm saying he's riding a wave. He's not causing the wave. But this emphasis on nationalism, I think this is exactly what we're going to see more of. I worry about it in Europe. We can talk about that later. But I think Trump has somehow captured something. And what he's captured, and now I come to my earlier remark, he's captured the utter failure, in my view, of this grand experiment. You can date to 1989, the end of the Cold War, this idea that somehow we could move to globalization, and that its counterpoint, and here I think we really need to think deeply about this, its necessary counterpoint is identity politics. And by identity politics, I mean the idea that you and I are not citizens of a country charged to build a world together, irrespective of the predicates that attach to us, race, class, gender, et cetera, but rather that is who we essentially are, and we can rest self-satisfied in those identities. This, I think, has been the great catastrophe of the last 18 or 20 years. If you're under the age of 35, I think it's very difficult to imagine a world that isn't constituted by the idea of globalism. I still have huge arguments with my colleagues, my older colleagues, about whether globalism is inevitable. My view is that, it's actually this tremendous experiment. The counterpoint, or the point I would make to buttress this is that, in 1648, there was something called the Peace of Westphalia. And it was basically the idea that from here on, we were going to organize the world in accordance with nations. These were going to be the sovereign units that we were going to work within. What happened after 1989 was we moved in two different directions. We moved supranationally toward all the various global institutions, and we moved subnationally to our identities. This is a fantastic experiment which tries to throw out the whole of the Westphalian system, the nation-state system. And my view is it simply cannot work. And the person that you would go to, and he's not in your readings, but you should read him, it's Thomas Hobbes, who writes in 1651 this book called The Leviathan. And he's arguing against the suprastatists and the substatists in that book, except that in his case, it's the Roman Catholic Church and the Presbyterians, both of whom he's attacking. That's another story. But the above and below wager about where sovereignty lies has been the great experiment since 1989. The above and below national sovereignty. Suprastate sovereignty, substate sovereignty. So in the above case, it's we can't solve our problems as nations. We have to have global free trade. We have to have international law, global norms, international accords about climate change. All these things have to be solved at the supranational level because the world is one great big system. That's one part of it. The other part is the sub-state portion, and that's the idea that rational citizens can't really solve these problems. We're not reasonable beings. We're bearers of this or that identity who are owed something that the state will pay through ever-expanding debt financing, 19.4 trillion as of the end of 2016. And so you have this paradox of the disembodied self who imagines his or her identity in relation to that of others. Politics is not engagement, it's activism, yes, but not the long and always compromising activity of actual citizens, and the importance of global coordination. And of course, the magic watchword for this has been management. We're going to manage the global system. This is really unthinkable prior to 1989. And so you get to something I'm going to write up one of these days, this phenomena that I call management society and selfie man. Management society and selfie man. We have this comprehensive global management, which none of us are responsible for because it's too big for us to solve, and yet we're completely self-referential because we're all walking around taking selfies, and we think of ourselves as bearers of identity. I mean, it's really this extraordinary paradox. And to anticipate where I'm going with Tocqueville, Tocqueville's argument is both of these two nodal points of human experience, this global cosmopolitan frame of mind and this completely self-referential bearer of identity, neither one of these will work. And he predicted that it would happen. And what has to happen is that we have to engage one another in face-to-face encounters in order to build a world together. And I will get to that point. Now, quickly, I'm going to say something about the Democratic Party. So I think the Democratic Party has two problems, neither of which they're going to face. One is this identity politics, which I want to say a bit more about first, and then I want to talk about something called middle-class anxiety, which we all have, by the way. I don't care how much money we all have middle-class anxiety. Shh, don't tell anyone, okay? But the identity politics, everybody walks around saying, I have an identity. This is very peculiar. 30 years ago, when I was in graduate school, nobody used the word identity. This is all new. And people say, well, I have an identity. And I said, well, look, throughout history, we've identified ourselves as being of this kind or that kind. Identity is different. Identity, first of all, has a moral intonation about guilt and fault. And secondly, it's a relationship. And I press this point because I think the Democratic Party has really gone off a deep end on identity politics. You measure your debt points in identity politics by virtue of your distance from the principal offender, namely the white heterosexual male. This is a problem. This is a very serious problem. If I had time, I would develop how this, I think, can be corrected, but identity is a relationship. Identity politics is a relationship to the principal offender, which is the white heterosexual male. Now, I think this has been a catastrophe for the Democratic Party because, and now I'm going to come to middle-class anxiety, because what it cannot see when everybody is seen in terms of an identity bearer, what it cannot see is that the fundamental problem in America, and Tocqueville saw this in the 1830s, is what he called middle-class anxiety. And so you're asking the question, what is middle-class anxiety? And so Tocqueville says it's this. He says, when you have an aristocracy where everybody's position is fixed, you can rise and fall only so far. You can be worried, you can suffer, but you don't have class anxiety. But he says, when all that changes, when the world of class standing gets disrupted, and this is what happens, whether it's capitalism or whatever in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, doesn't matter. But class shifts, and nobody is certain as they once were. And he says middle-class anxiety is that condition in which, here it is, you ready? You have tasted enough goods of the world that you know what it's like to enjoy them, but you're never secure enough that you don't worry about losing them. Okay? You've tasted enough of the goods of the world that you know what it's like to enjoy them, but you're never secure enough, and so you worry about losing them. Okay? That's middle-class anxiety. This anxiety haunts America, Tocqueville saw in the 1830s. But if you can only see through the lens of identity politics, then this vast swath of America is only seen as white, not suffering middle-class anxiety. And I'm old enough, and I came out of the earlier Democratic Party that was very much concerned about the middle class. Okay? And that has all gone because identity politics has taken over. Now, one more thing. My argument increasingly is that identity politics has done the greatest harm, not to whites, forget whites, it's done tremendous harm to the African American community. Why? Because if you come out of Martin Luther King, you understand that yes, there's guilt and fault. We've got a 250-year legacy of legalized slavery in America, yes. But what King understood through the Christian perspective is that however the worldly calculation about fault and debt work out, in the final analysis, this is a spiritual thing that can only be resolved through repentance and forgiveness. But with identity politics, you get as far as guilt and fault, but you repudiate the spiritual dimensions of this altogether. So you have never-ending debt. Never-ending debt. So this is half Christian, and this is what is so pernicious about this. Now, it's hurt that the African Americans because from the vantage point of King, you can see that, yes, there's a problem here. We have a legacy of slavery, and we have to do something about it. Not quite clear exactly what, but the African American community is a distinct community. I mentioned around the table that my father's family came from Lebanon in the 1890s. And by identity politics logic, my father's immigrant family would be entitled to debt points against the great oppressor. But I think this is nonsense. Because the only group that really, I think, has the two groups that really have a lot of work to do are blacks and whites. But all the rest of the immigrants, my view, I say this as an immigrant, is really stand in line. It's going to take a few generations. But the African American community has been used in a way by the Democratic Party. The wound, the racial wound between black and white has been used as a template. And then the African Americans have been pushed aside, and they're now recognized as one identity group among all sorts of other different identity groups. I think this is a catastrophe. And so my argument is the only way the Democratic Party is going to stop its tailspin into further ramifications of identity politics, which is only going to result in eating their own. I mean, it's just a terrible cannibalism that will occur. The only way the Democratic Party can step out of this mess is if the African Americans stand up and say, enough. We're not just one identity politics group among many. There's a specific historical wound. And then the question of government involvement in that, well, there too, I think King really did have the message, which is the government can supplement the actions that we have in society, but in the final analysis, it can't substitute it. And the really hard work has to be done in the churches and the synagogues to heal that wound in America. So I think the Democratic Party is in really serious trouble as well, because it hurts the African American community, which it initially intended most to help, and it's blind to middle class anxiety, which is why Trump could march through Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and take it, because there you have this white middle class anxiety, which could not be seen as anything other than white privilege if you're a member of the Democratic Party under Hillary Clinton. And I think the Democrats have a huge amount of work to do. The Republicans too, because they're utterly incoherent. Based on what I said, those 5 different groups, it won't hold together anymore. So we're at this remarkable moment in American history where the Democrats have to reinvent themselves and the Republicans have to reinvent themselves. And I say, thankfully, this is so. We have to have a kind of renewal, and I hope both parties can thrive in this. They have to do a lot of hard work, but the old order is over, and I'm thankful for that. Now, I actually don't specialize in contemporary politics, but I have some views on it. What I want to do is talk about Plato for a bit, if you don't mind. Plato, the Republic is, in my view, the highest book written by mortal hand. I've studied it for 30 years, 35 years. I still don't think I fully have a handle on it, but let me just say some things about it, because it actually does bear on this whole identity politics thing. As you read into Book 8, which is one of the assigned sections, I think he has a lot to say about where identity politics goes. So first, who is Plato writing against? Well, he's writing against the poets, the sophists, and the politicians. The remarkable thing about Plato is he makes this claim: only philosophy can save us. Only philosophy can save us. Now, what would have to happen in your life for you to conclude that only philosophy can save us? And I think the answer, because it does bear on where we are today, the answer is he witnessed Athenian democracy utterly crumbling. And so he could look around and he could see, well, maybe there's a Trump-like character, a Hillary Clinton character, and they're going to promise reform. And what Plato understood is sometimes your society gets to the place where political reforms just aren't going to do it. Because the problem is so much deeper than politics. The problem is the kinds of souls that you have in your society. And so the whole of the Republic is really, while it appears to be a book about building the perfect state, it's actually not. It's about the soul, how to best understand the soul. And his argument is only the philosophical soul is the one that can help save us. The rest are always on a decline. In Book 8, I'll say a bit more about this in a second. Book 8 is a story of the decline of the different types, right? You go from the honor-loving soul to the wealth-loving soul to the freedom-loving soul. And what's frightening is that after the freedom-loving soul, the necessary kind that emerges is the tyrannical, power-loving soul, which implies that lurking within this democratic language of toleration, diversity, pluralism is only one thing, namely the love of power. Okay? And only philosophy can save us from that. So, I didn't have to ask this question to my students 20 years ago, but I do have to ask it now. Do human beings have a soul? I took this for granted 30 years ago, but it's not clear to me that my students think that way anymore. And I think identity politics is a clear indicator of this. So they'll say I have an identity, but they will not say that I have a soul. And I think what we're doing is we're running around looking at different identities and dividing the world up that way. So we look at race, class, gender. And Plato would say and did say that you have really misunderstood the human situation if you can only look at the surface of things and look at the mere appearances, the visage that we give off, and say, well, that's that kind of thing. He said, no, the problem is in the soul, and so we have to think deeply about the kinds of souls that there are. And his view was that there are actually 5 kinds of souls. So our attempt to run around and say, well, let's use me. Oh, he's a Lebanese, right? Or you're from, pick your favorite spot, right? He's saying, no. That's not how you understand human beings. You have to figure out what kind of souls they have. Because if you have a preponderance of one kind of soul, your society can't be anything other than that. If your society is ruled by honor, if you have lots of souls that love honor and war, and I will tell you, the Kurdish Peshmerga that I worked with were these souls. These were the warriors, right? That you're going to have certain things that are possible and other things that are not possible. If you are ruled by the love of wealth, if your soul is oriented by the love of money, certain things are possible and other things are not possible. And the same with love of honor or love of freedom and love of power. Let me just quickly lay this out. So Plato thought that there were 3 parts of the soul. And I don't know if this is in the it is. Yes, it is. 3 parts of the soul. The appetites, the honor-loving, and the philosophical part. And what's curious is that each of them have a particular relationship to death. If you're ruled by the appetites, you are afraid to die. If you're ruled by honor, you are more than willing to die so that your name will be remembered for all time. Heroic deeds. If you're ruled by philosophy, you are prepared to practice philosophical death, and I hope this question comes up. What does that mean tomorrow? Not that you will be remembered for all time in time, but that you can be illuminated by eternity itself. And Plato says, depending upon what love you have, your soul is going to be a certain sort. So if you love wisdom, only philosophy can save us. If you love wisdom, then your soul will be one, and it'll be right ordering in its parts. Reason will rule and will give honor its due and give the appetites their due. It's not that you can't enjoy a good meal, but you just can't let the appetites rule. If you're ruled by honor, you'll have a brittle soul. You'll be a warrior. That's why the first education in the Republic is the education unto music, to soften the warrior souls in Athens. Okay? You have to soften the warriors. That's what I was doing up in Kurdistan. I had the warriors, the Peshmerga, and I was trying to bring liberal arts. I thought about what I was doing in Qatar or in Iraq in Platonic terms. If you're ruled, there's three ways in which the appetitive part of the soul can rule. If you're ruled by money, you've decided to repress most of your appetites, but save, right? And so you can get wealthy. If you let the appetites come at you a little bit faster, then you are a democratic soul. And here the appetites are coming at you a little quicker. And instead of controlling them and repressing them as the oligarchic, wealth-loving soul does, what you declare is, I'm going to be spontaneous. Now what that means is the appetites are coming at you fast enough that you can't control them, so you just let them come out. And this is his picture of democracy. Democracy is for him not a political form, it's a soul type. It's the soul that believes that every appetite has a right to exist, and every appetite is equal. And I ask you if that's not exactly what we're wrestling with today in our society. Every desire, sexual desire, every appetite is exactly equal. But Plato says this is not the end of it, because the appetites can come at you even faster. Because if philosophy is not ruling, the appetites, which are infinite, he says, will come at you faster and faster. And at one point, the appetites come at you so fast that there's no pluralism, there's no let everybody have their desires. We can build a world defended by law where every lifestyle is acceptable, which is exactly the project of America today. No, he says at some point the appetites come at you so fast that you realize pluralism is dead. I just have to fight for as much power as I possibly can to gratify every single appetite that I have. And so he has deep worries about what happens when the appetitive part of the soul completely comes to rule. It partly rules with the wealth-loving soul. It rules more with the democratic soul. But there's nothing stopping the appetites from coming at you faster and faster and faster. He says only philosophy can save us. So what he sees in the transition between democracy and tyranny, and this is in your reading in Book 8, is the move from toleration and pluralism, let's call it multiculturalism, to suddenly people just using these lifestyles they have as pretext for gaining more power. And some of you may have heard this term, cultural appropriation, where now it's not possible for, say, if I had a Lebanese story and you weren't Lebanese, you couldn't say my story. Only I have the right to use my story. Plato sees what's happening. He sees this 2,400 years ago, what happens to a democracy if philosophy doesn't rule. Now, Tocqueville, I got a few more minutes, yes? Okay. Just give me the cane, whatever. So Tocqueville has a different wager. Right? The Platonic wager is only philosophy can save us. But I think the Tocquevillian wager is only institutions can save us. And I want to develop that. But let me just give you the rough framework of Tocqueville. He's writing in the 19th century, and he's writing at a time when it was really unclear whether aristocracy or democracy were going to prevail. And after the French Revolution, people said, well, we can put this democracy thing back in the bag. And so many of Tocqueville's friends were aristocrats. Tocqueville himself was an aristocrat. So many of his letters were written to aristocratic friends of his, all of whom were hoping that, in fact, we could put this thing back. But Tocqueville knew that democracy was coming. Now, here too, like Plato, he's a little craftier than us. He doesn't think of democracy, first and foremost, as a political category. He says it's a social category. And he's, as I said, one of the great social theorists. So what does it mean? What does social mean here in the context of equality? He will use the phrase, it's right in the beginning of the book and it's throughout, social conditions of equality. Democracy is characterized by social conditions of equality. What he means by that is, look, there can be political inequalities, there can be economic inequalities. But what's happening with this revolution that God has brought about, he says this, it's providentially ordained that we're moving in this direction. What's happened as we move to conditions of social equality is we can look at one another and say, and recognize our differences in wealth or political standing, but we can look into each other's eyes and see not a role, but a person. Got it? It's not, I don't engage you as somebody who has an obligation because of my role. So when I was in Iraq, I had these 2 bodyguards, carried AK-47s. They were the most loyal bodyguards you could ever have. They were poor as could be. They insisted on spending a portion of their paycheck. As we drove across the mountains to Erbil, they would stop at the store. They had a role, period, and that's how they lived. And they were offended if I would not let them live out their role. Tocqueville says the Great Revolution is we move from that kind of a world where everybody is connected in a great long chain through roles of obligation and loyalty, to a world where that falls apart and we move from roles in the aristocratic age to persons in the democratic age, where we can look into each other's eyes and see the suffering and have sympathy for other people. This was the great revolution Tocqueville thought was happening. So social conditions of equality isn't we all have the same amount of money. It isn't we all have the same political standing. It is, irrespective of that, I can look into your eyes and you can look into my eyes and I can see a person and you can see a person. This is for him the great revolution that occurs. Now, there are social consequences of this and psychological consequences of this. So when you move from a world of interlinking persons and you have a mediating body called the aristocracy, which mediates between the one powerful king and the many down below, you have you have the middle filled out with the aristocrats. So work with me here. So I don't have a board. So in the aristocratic age, you've got the king, the nobles, and those who answer to the nobles, who find the nobles authoritative. And as you move from the aristocratic age to the democratic age, you've got substituting for the king, the state, substituting for the lower level, citizens. And the great question for him is, what occupies the middle? What is it that can gather us together? This is the great question in democracy in America. How can we be gathered together? And Tocqueville's answer to this, and you've heard the phrase, is voluntary associations. We have to build a world together. The reason why Tocqueville loved American federalism was because he knew that the future of democracy is not turmoil and revolution. This is his key insight that nobody saw in the 1830s. The future of democracy is quietude and senescence. It's everybody having a Facebook post and going quietly to sleep. This is why I give another lecture, which I'm not going to give tonight, called Facebook is Death. Okay? Oh yes, Facebook is death. It's a lecture I give to my students. So Tocqueville thought that this problem of I'll call it the evacuation of the middle, there's nothing that gathers all these people together, and he worried that what would happen would be that the state would do all the work. So that people would be lonely and isolated, they would look to the powerful state, they would not look to their neighbors. And so he says in one place, tyrants will forgive citizens for not loving him, provided they do not love each other. It's brilliant. As long as you keep people isolated, you can have submission amongst your subjects, which call themselves citizens. Now, but there's a bigger, there's also an experiential component of this, and now I come to globalism and identity politics. So what Tocqueville thought was that not only would social space have this kind of top and bottom part with the middle evacuated, but he thought human experience would come to take this form as well. And so what he thought was that that authority wouldn't go away in the democratic age. Authority would move in two different directions at once. It would move upward to what he called public opinion. You can think of this as politically correct speech in whatever age it is. And downward to what I will call soliloquies. So what he thought human experience would look like in the late democratic age was that we would walk around in public talking about the latest TV shows, the Netflix things we watched, the sports teams. And then we would go home quietly and post on our Facebook page, and then if somebody didn't like, we just defriend. And so we'd have our completely self-enclosed soliloquies, right? The private life of our own private identities, and then the kind of global life of public culture. And there would be nothing in between. And his argument is the reason why these two things are alike is because neither one of them involve risk. Talking about public culture, being a globalist, everyone agrees, right? Talking about your identity, posting on Facebook, no risk. And what he worried about was souls would come to emerge in the democratic soul that were scared to death of face-to-face associations. And so he says, in one of the most prophetic passages in the whole of democracy in America, feelings and ideas are renewed, the heart enlarged, the mind expanded, only by the reciprocal actions of men one upon another. We have to meet in the face-to-face, and of course that's where recognition occurs, right? Now, I'm going to say one more thing, because I think I'm probably running out of time. Tocqueville thought, you ready? Here's a shocker. Tocqueville thought that the natural condition of man was manic depression and bipolarity. And now I need to defend that, okay? So I think that us winning the Cold War has actually done a tremendous disservice to us, because there's a long line of philosophical inquiry that understood that human beings are tremendously unstable. Now, we've medicalized it. And Huxley saw this in the 1930s. We've medicalized it. It's a brain chemistry problem. Tocqueville didn't think it's a brain chemistry problem. And I think by winning the Cold War, we have this economic account of human beings. They're merely rational preference maximizers. This is a catastrophe because it misunderstands, or it covers over this much longer pedigree of understanding about who human beings are. They're tremendously unstable. I mean, you look at the Confessions of Augustine, and what's he doing? He's oscillating back and forth between the frenzy of being a public rhetorician and then being broodingly withdrawing because he's not famous, and so he's manic depressive. And what's his answer? There is no rest until I rest in thee. God, right? I'm not going to go through Hobbes. It's in Hobbes. Rousseau has this beautiful phrase, melancholy is the friend of delight in Emile. They all see this. And I think Tocqueville sees this too. And so people say, well, Tocqueville, yes, he believes that institutions will save us, as I declared. But if you don't understand the manic depressive part, you don't understand why institutions can save us. So on Tocqueville's reading, we have this bipolarity. And he thinks the family, civic associations, and I'll include religious, local political institutions, and religion are central to addressing, not solving, because there's no solving, there's ameliorating the problem of the bipolarity of man. And I want to go through each of those very quickly. Family. There is a male socialization problem. Men are monsters. Okay? And Tocqueville's view, and it follows from Rousseau, is that without the family, men are going to be frenetically throwing themselves into the world. And you have to somehow tone that down. And both Tocqueville and Rousseau thought only women in the family could do that. So when he thinks about the family, he's thinking about generation. This is a whole other subject, which I get into huge debates with my students about. I mean, the generative family is so important to Tocqueville. But he is thinking very much about the problem of male socialization. If you have any doubts about the connection between Tocqueville and Rousseau, go look at the end of the Emile, which is the famous educational treatise Rousseau writes in 1761. It's all there. Now we do civic associations and local politics. So why do we need civic institutions? They're so very inefficient. And Tocqueville's argument is, if you have local groups, if you have people working together, either on political or bird-watching club matters, they're drawn out of themselves. And we know how this happens. And when we get into a funk and a friend calls us up and says, hey, come on. And then you go and you have tea or whatever and you work something through and suddenly you're thinking, wow, that's pretty neat. I don't feel the way I did before. Tocqueville really thought that unless we had constant opportunities to engage one another, we would fall into loneliness and isolation. We would fall into depression. Make no mistake about it. This is why I so worry about the younger generation that has the appearance of friends through Facebook. This is part of the Facebook is Death lecture. They have the appearance of friendship, but if you look at statistics about depression, et cetera, I mean, they're skyrocketing. Suicide rates, it's skyrocketing among this generation that lives on glass. Not in face-to-face, but lives through glass. This is a catastrophe. And then political institutions are important too, because we want to say, well, the purpose of politics is to represent. Tocqueville would put it another way. The purpose of politics is in part to represent, but it is to educe, to draw people out of themselves. This is why local politics is so very important. It is inefficient to have federalism. It's very inefficient. But he says, I praise democracy not for what it does, but for what it causes to be done. What it does is a mess. What it causes to be done is it draws people out of themselves. So they have to work with their neighbor. This is how we have to fix our country. That's why I said the problem is not populism. The problem is the lonely, disembodied soul that Tocqueville saw. And the antidote is this coming together to build a world at the neighborhood level. Because if we don't, we're psychologically damaged by not doing it. And then religion. Tocqueville's tortured relationship to the Roman Catholic Church I'm not going to talk about, except I will cite the late Peter Lawler, who said, Tocqueville didn't believe in God, but he worried about what God thought of that. So when it comes to religion, he says, yeah, think about that one. He says, isn't it interesting that the two great commandments, love your neighbor and love God, correspond exactly to this bipolar condition in human life? Why are we called to love God? Because we're prone to throw ourselves frantically, maniacally into the world. And God reminds us that no, there's something higher. Why are we called to love our neighbor? Because we're prone to depression. And so we have to reach out and go beyond ourselves. So if you look at these institutions that he thinks are so important, they all address this fundamental problem of bipolarity. And my worry is that we're medicalizing ourselves. And I'm not a doctor. I'm not telling anybody what to do. But if there's a real sociological problem, that we're building a world where we're completely lonely and isolated from one another, and we're medicalizing it, how can we see the extent of the problem unless we feel a bit of the pain and take a bit of the risk? And so Tocqueville thought that political action, and I will end with this, it's not great deeds and heroic actions. In a democratic society, if you want to save it, to have what he called equality and freedom, You have to have people working together face to face. That's what political action is. Not over the grandest things. We'll let the elites do that. But with our neighbors, we have to work face to face. And he says, working with your neighbor is the best possible antidote to the dreamy idealism of utopianists. Because when you look at your neighbor, and I'm the head of a homeowners association, so I can say this. Yeah, you look at your neighbor and you realize these wonderful dreams you had, they're never going to come to pass. There's no way. And so you just have to take the next step and work with your neighbor and build a world that's always going to be messy and non-parsimonious, but that's the world in the democratic age. I'll stop with that.
Speak to that first point you made about how we've lost a sense of nationhood, let's say, and there's a hunger for participation. Why is it that Democrats in particular are so unable to articulate a positive, progressive vision of American nationality and pride? I mean, Ben Wattenberg did a book called The First Universal Nation 25 years ago, and Ben was a conservative Democrat. And there's something inspiring about the idea of a nation of nations, Filipinos, Italians, Germans, blacks, forming a common identity. But somehow Democrats can't articulate that anymore. What's the problem?
So I always think about, that's a great question, I always think about this in political theory terms. So I mentioned earlier that I came out of the Democratic Party, and growing up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, that's all there was, in the 1960s. But so I make a couple of lines here. So I think after 1968, with McGovern, you saw the Democratic Party shifting to a kind of Marxist rhetoric, a deep suspicion of corporations. Well, that was in a way always there, but real Marxist overtones, a deep suspicion of American nationalism, and the Vietnam War didn't help. I mean, we have to admit that. But I think it's gone farther than that. This is why I think the Tocqueville French Revolution thing is so important. On the left, and I don't mean here moderate Democrats, but on the left, which I think really owns the Democratic Party now, the idea that you could be committed to anything particular is not thinkable anymore. So a commitment to a particular religion, a particular nation. This was exactly the French Revolution problem. I mean, remember at the end of the French Revolution, they had what was called the Terror, where anyone who was committed to anything in particular was just killed. And so you get the emergence of this universalist frame of mind, which I think was subdued in the earlier progressive movement because there were real national problems. But this is what has come to prevail in the Democratic Party, is this kind of universalist, globalist frame of mind. And I think it's terribly, terribly destructive. And the moderate Democrats who may have had this vision, what I would call the Hubert Humphrey Democrats, they're all gone. They have been pushed aside. And I'm terribly worried about the Democratic Party because I see no way out unless the African Americans step back in and say enough to identity politics. But the idea of a healthy nation, I just don't see it coming from the Democratic Party. Let me say one thing about there's a difference between what Tocqueville called well-considered patriotism and nationalism. I wince when I hear the word nationalism. Nationalism is not a good thing. Nationalism is the cult of nations. I think well-considered patriotism is what you want to have. And Tocqueville's argument is you get well-considered patriotism when everybody has a place in the political battle, whether it's local or national. Then you come to love your country. But when you strip that away and the state becomes the only thing that's around, that kind of well-considered patriotism isn't going to work. I'm quite worried. I told you, let me just go on for 1 minute. I said that globalism and identity politics is falling apart before our eyes. We are going to go back to a world of nations. My worry is not whether that can be retained. My worry is what kind of nationalism we're going to have. And I don't like saying this, but I think in America we've got enough of a capital L liberal tradition that it won't become xenophobic nationalism. It's exactly what you're describing in that book. But I do worry about Europe. I have huge worries about Europe because I think the return to the nation in Europe is going to cause all sorts of troubles. And you can already see this in Marie Le Pen and Geert Wilders and others. I think that's the problem. You're right. Or one could argue Hungary or other places. No, I agree. This is a big problem.
So I'm missing one little part of I'm missing one little part of your narrative, and that's the one that says the Democrats are devoted to the identity politics, but that it was going to persist until the black race,
Right.
until the African Americans say that's enough. But do I just take it as completely cynical that there wasn't any reference in this past election on the part of the Democrats to the plight of the inner city people? I mean, it's just taken as a given, and they take the 90% of the vote,
Yeah.
and to hell with them.
Yeah, well, and I say this everywhere I go. I mean, I think that the Democratic Party has betrayed the African American community. That it counts on their votes, and as we all know, many members of the African American community are church going and have various views on marriage, and these are simply not allowable in the Democratic Party. So, what happened? I didn't fully understand what had happened until I was in the Middle East. My Middle Eastern students were saying, Professor Mitchell, why are all the left-wing colleagues insisting that I speak the language of identity politics? This is really curious. In other words, the only way that you can gain admission to the Democratic Party is if you're going to speak the language of identity politics and fault and debt. And my Middle Eastern students are just very perplexed by this. And then it got me thinking about what the African American community has to do. And I know a number of people, and they say, look, there's two languages we speak. There's the language we speak within the African American community, and then there's what we have to do to speak within the progressive white party. And there's been promise after promise after promise made to the African American community. None of it has really panned out except for what's called the talented 10th. But as a whole, the African community, if you take away that, it's still back where it was in the 60s. This is a catastrophe. And my view is that what's going to happen, it's not going to happen through the political parties. It's going to happen when church leaders in the African American community say, we have a language. It's called the language of Martin Luther King. It's the covenantal language that so many African American churches have natively and now has been penetrated and overrun by this identity politics stuff on the left. It's literally going to take pastors, and I'm actually involved in a group. We're trying to get a big conference together, African Americans and white religious leaders, to talk about this, that somehow the African American community has been co-opted by this left-wing identity politics language. And I think it's only when the African Americans stand up and say enough. Now, will they? No, because deeply entrenched interests. It's going to take a long time. But I think that is the only path forward. Otherwise, it's just spiraling down into, anyone who opposes identity politics is called a racist, a homophobe, or whatever. And this is just preposterous. It's just preposterous. I'll just say this. You can't have the language of fault and guilt ripped from its Christian context, because then it's just permanent debt. And some of you know the reference. In the 1890s, there was this guy called Nietzsche. And Nietzsche's view was that the West would be paralyzed for the next 200 or 300 years. It would have rejected its religion, Christianity, but it would hang on to notions that come from Christianity: equality, dignity of persons, and guilt. So we're in this really weird intermediary stage where we've got the Christian language of guilt, but we don't have the larger apparatus of Christianity to resolve it. And what Nietzsche said would happen someday was people would wake up and say, yeah, we did this to you and we don't care. They'll completely wash away the language of guilt. And so we have two choices in front of us for Nietzsche, and I think he's right. Either we go all the way and get rid of it all and go back to aristocratic cruelty, which is what he called for, or we can not live in this halfway position where we have the trappings of Christianity without the full mechanism. And that's what identity politics is. It's guilt and fault without any kind of atonement or forgiveness. It can't work. I'm worried, though, that instead of going back to the Christian, we'll go forward to the Nietzschean one, and we'll have new cruelty. That's what Nietzsche predicted in the 1880s. And I'm holding my breath, because that's what I'm concerned about.
One more question?
You had mentioned at one point that you, in working with college students, it used to be a given that we do have a soul. You didn't really elaborate too much on what the answer is. In that sense, we saw with the election this past November, I'm sure everyone can identify with great concern and disturbance of heart to see our young people, the hope of our future, seemingly in schools all over the country, out protesting and really being interviewed and sounding, fascist. What is your sense? You're in academia, you're at Georgetown. I guess 2 questions. How can we reach the young? I work with children K through 8 at a Catholic school. The children are coming from public school. And so I'm getting a sense that a lot of even what they're getting in the public schools or they have is a sense of power, and inequality and the guilt. I know when I went to Rutgers, all the sociology classes and everything, it was all about that. In the education courses I took later, maybe the last 10 years, it was all focused on that. So I guess, is it as permeative, is it as bad as it seems? And is even philosophy, classical philosophy, part of a norm in academia, in the college level? What is your sense of hope there? How can we help the situation? Or
Each time I think it can't get worse, it does. I cannot believe what's happened. I'm actually, though, I would say, I'm fortunate because I teach history of Western political philosophy. And so all these kids come in with identity politics, and when I show them the real intellectual roots of this in Nietzsche, they actually don't want to go that far. It's the same, by the way, with Marxism. So Marx in the Communist Manifesto singles out bourgeois socialism as the worst possible thing. Bourgeois socialism is social justice. I mean, at least as it is understood on the left. It's let's keep this capitalist system, but let's just skin off a little bit and redistribute. Marx hated this stuff. So my policy is always to show that the left, the positions they think they hold aren't radical, that if they really want to be radical, they need to go really and read Marx and really read Nietzsche. And so I don't want to push back against them. I want to take them even further to show where their position goes. And the interesting thing is when you do that, they actually step back from the precipice and say, well, if that's where Nietzsche goes, I'm not so sure I want to do identity politics. If that's where Marx goes, I'm not sure I want to do social justice. So I think, this is, by the way, a Platonic way of proceeding. I mean, Plato doesn't oppose. He takes people to the full implications of what they think. So, if I may, the whole of Book 1 of the Republic is these different understandings of justice being played out. And Socrates never opposes him. He says, well, but isn't the implication of that this, and this? And the conversation does not begin until Book 2, the real conversation, because up till Book 1, they're all trying to defend their positions. And Socrates gently shows that, no, it's not going to work. And then they become open, and they ask Socrates, well, we're perplexed. And it's only when you get to that position of perplexity that you can begin to learn. And I will say that while this identity politics thing is everywhere, it's not more than a few sentences deep. I mean, it's reflexive, it's not reflective. So I think that is actually the hopeful sign. But they're, getting rid of the courses I teach, and there's very few of us left. Like I say.
Please join me in thanking.